So let's take a look at some of the past and future of operations management. So if we look, I believe this is from your textbook, some of the significant events in operations management. And if you see, they've got it broken up into four major kind of eras. The first era is where we really focused on cost. The second era, we focus on quality. The third era, we focus on customization. And the final one, the one that we're in now, is kind of a globalization. And so if we look, starting around the formation of our country, we really started to look at things like labor specialization, standardizing of parts. And it was really in the 1880s and the 1910s, right before and leading up to World War I, this kind of scientific management era, where we started looking at Gantt charts, which is actually something that's still used today, and it's really about helping to schedule things, motion and time studies, processes analysis, and queuing theory. And then really the mass production era, the moving assembly line, which is really what Ford is really famous for, and things of that nature. And then in the 80s, we started looking at lean production, and this is where you're going to see a lot of the stuff talking about things like Six Sigma and whatnot. Just in time became a really big thing, and this is the era where I was a kid, and so I remember all this stuff coming in. So just in time was, okay, well, we're going to send this product out, but we're going to have it show up right before we need to send it out. Computer-aided design, or CAD's a big thing in engineering, and it allowed you to virtually create products. Total quality management. And then we move into the mass customization era, and this really kicked off with the beginning of the internet. And so this is where you're able to basically, like you can do now, you can go and order what you want, customized just for you. And so it's really big into the internet and e-commerce, and starting to look at enterprise resource planning, the creation of ISOs, which are international quality standards. Really started to get into supply chain management because things started to really globalize after the creation of the internet, at least to the consumer. And, you know, a lot of build to order kind of things and RFID tags. And now the globalization focus, this is where we're really everything. We're looking at everything as a global supply chain, global logistics, the growth of transnational organizations. So you have these companies that supersede countries, and it's no longer really an American company, but it's an everything company, really looking at sustainability of products, ethics in the workplace. And we're also starting to look at things like the Internet of Things. Basically everything that we have is an internet-enabled device where you can collect data and all the positive and negatives of that. So let's talk about one of the big things in the future of operation management, and one of the big things that we look at a lot would be analytics, the so-called big data. And so from the big data, what we're doing is we're taking all that information from whatever we have, because we are collecting so much information about things that no one ever thought that we'd get all of this. And so now you've got this pile of data, and the question really becomes, well, how do we turn this pile of data into something useful? Now, there's a lot of good and bad aspects about the whole idea of big data, because yes, you can hyper focus down on things and know exactly what your customers want, and then on the other side you've got giving up a lot of privacy concerns and whatnot. So there's a fine line that you walk between that stuff, but no matter what, it is here, and that's what people are dealing with, and that's what we're going to operations managers deal with a lot, is how do I mine that data and get something useful out of it? And one of the interesting things, the journal interfaces is really an application-based company example journal. If you end up taking the MBA 690 course, we actually use the Interfaces journal to do presentations on, because they're talking about ways companies are using operations management techniques to improve their company. And so basically, scheduling is always going to be something for operations management, especially when we extend it out into the service sector. Locations, where do we put our product distribution distribution center? Where's our retail outlets? Where's our bus stations? Where's our train stations? The layouts. How do I lay out the bank and the restaurant? You may think, oh, they just throw them out. Actually, somebody is looking at that. It's like, how do I make this restaurant the most efficient that I can be? Both in front house and behind house. How do I set up my service kitchen to be the most efficient that it can be? And in fact, if you ever want a really good example of that, if you ever take a cruise, which right now doesn't sound like something that a lot of people would be doing in the midst of COVID, but you can always get a tour of the kitchen area, and it's amazing because in such a small area, they've got it set up to where they have maximum productivity. And somebody sat down and studied that. Same thing with a bank. You know, the layouts of banks they analyze exactly how to be as efficient as they can. Demanding forecasts, and we're going to talk a lot about forecasting in the next chapter, is when are we going to need people? When are we going to get you have to analyze the data. If you work at a call center, when do we get the most calls? You need to know that because you need to schedule more people there. And so that's really interesting work that you can do with the data. And so vehicle routing, especially if you're moving people or products, you really need to figure out how to efficiently do it. Queuing theory, which is basically just talking about lines. That's an operations management thing. And actually, just speaking of queuing theory, one of the more interesting companies that handles that is Disney World. If you go to Disney and you get into some of those lines, like our 2-hour-long line, it's not just a line. So if you, the new Disney ride is Rise of the Resistance. And I don't like anything Disney's done with Star Wars, but they can make a really good ride. The line to get into it, even though it's really long, it's very interactive in the line. So it's not as bad as just standing in a line for an hour and a half to ride a ride. And so this is all the kind of stuff that operations management ends up looking at. The other thing is you can use your operations strategy as a competitive weapon. And so you can use it to differentiate yourself from the competition. You can sit there and go, hey, because of our operations strategy, we are a net zero carbon producer. Or, you know, because of our strategy, we optimize everything that we use and we produce no waste. And you can think of a lot of different ways that on a marketing side, you could use how well your operations are just to make yourself better. I mean, think about German products. And German products, a lot will talk about our engineering. We're so precision. Everything is done to tight tolerances. And that really gives them an advantage over another company because you sit there and you start to equate, well, this is quality because their operations are so tightly controlled. And that's why, you know, you'd probably buy a car from Germany before you would buy one from China because China's got a different operations way it's going, and they don't have that same kind of ingrained, they can't use that as a competitive advantage. Where the Chinese obviously would be able to use the competitive advantage is we can do it cheap. And so but once again, now that gets into marketing, but that's just a way that you can use this for your advantage. And so that kind of feeds into this is, you know, operations management, you're really going to be focusing on quality because it used to be, if you want a really, really quality product, it was a luxury product. You were going to pay for it. Our processes have gotten so good now that most customers are expecting, I'm going to be buying a quality product. It's going to work. It's going to be good for a while. And so to be able to do that, this is where a lot of that lean manufacturing Six Sigma analysis comes into play, because this is ways that you can reduce cost and increase quality. So the supply chain management, and this is where you need to work with all the members of the supply chain because you want to achieve high levels of customer satisfaction. You need to be efficient. You need to have a competitive advantage. Right now, companies that had a supply chain that wasn't running through China, especially the beginning part of 2020, if you had a supply chain that ran through China, it was really affected by the COVID virus that nobody ever thought would end up being a problem. Supply chains were disrupted. Companies that had either parallel supply chains or supply chains that didn't run through China were still able to operate, so that gave them a competitive advantage over the other companies. And so this is just from BSI talking about supply chain threats, risks, and trends. And so this is the kind of thing that an operations management person would be looking into. And it's really, okay, well, how is dealing with these countries going to affect our supply chain? And so if you look right up here, the Modern Slavery Act of Britain, this one is a pretty big one because it really put a lot of clamps on all of the supply chain, because now you're responsible for everything that was going on. And it applied to companies dealing in Britain or working in Britain. And so it really affected a lot of what was going on. So if you were dealing with Britain, this was going to be changing your supply chain, because now you had to go, okay, what is my problems? I have to put more costs into this and this, that, and the other thing. And then in 2015, we're looking at Libya and some places in the Middle East because of frequent ISIS attacks. ISIS isn't around anymore for the most part. It's functionally gone, but they were causing problems with things that were coming from that area because of attacks. So that had a risk to the supply chain. So you had to worry about that. And so it's just really interesting. BSI puts this out every couple of years. You can look at it and, some of the key, we look down here, some of the key countries. Peru has corruption. Guatemala, political stability problems. Argentina, working. So those are all increased severity. India's got some child labor problems, which some companies will care about, will not care about. I'm not going to bring up any examples here because they're always quite fluctuating. But so, especially as you're looking at global supply chains, this is something you have to take into account. It's no longer you can just sit there and go, okay, well, we're getting our steel from Pittsburgh and we're building it, a ship here in Massachusetts, so that's all we're having to worry about. You're having to take a much more global perspective of what's going on. And so the next thing here we have the entire idea of lean operations, lean manufacturing, and it basically all comes down to the same thing. You're driving waste out of your production, you're increasing the efficiency. And so it's a net of making things cheaper. And so as you can see here, these are the 8 lean waste. This is something that if you get a certificate in lean manufacturing, lean operations or whatnot, this is the kind of stuff that you go over. And these are all basically easy things to get rid of. Like you look at transport. And that's basically a lot of how far do we move things, how long is it taking it. I'm manufacturing something on one side of the plant that after I get done manufacturing it, I have to move it to the other side of the plant for the next thing. Well, just put them right next to each other. You get rid of that without changing anything, but it does take just a little bit of analysis to figure out what the changes that you're going to make. And so we're really looking at an internationalization of operations. So really one of the big things that you have to do as an operations manager is manage a global network. And that is just being driven by cost, playing around with where can I get cheaper products from, and there's a lot of reasons why things may be cheaper or better quality someplace or another, but this is all stuff that has to be investigated while you're in this position. And so the last thing is we'll just look at some of the business majors and where their salaries end up, median, the high end, and the low end. And so basically just want to pull out here, logistics, supply chain. This is all the operations management stuff. Pretty nice, $53,000 starting salary. And it's one of the more robust ones that you can get typically coming out of the out of the management field. Management information systems tends to do a little bit better than logistics, but that's almost like an IT major at that point because you've got a lot of stuff going on there.